thank you all for indulging me in this, in more of me, which, but I promise it will be a departure from what I've previously said. So what I'm going to talk about today is a very specific case study of fulfillment that I've been working on for several years, and that is Ukrainian markets and bazaars. So it's a little bit of a diversion from what I typically talk about as outpost office work. So this work has been developing, as I said, for several years, and it began with my Fulbright Fellowship in 2014, and it's kind of grown to morph into different types of research projects, and it's been often influenced by conversation with Ukrainian urban historians, architects, anthropologists, and artists, and I would like to thank them also for their collaboration. It's really helped me form my own ideas about this topic. So, as capitalism expands to new territories in post-socialist contexts, shopping spaces are caught in the transformation of economic systems, giving formal characteristics to economic relationships. The result is a spliced condition of public and private spaces, many shopping cities with their own regulations, security forces, currencies, and social hierarchies. The space of shopping is neither democratic nor free. It can require negotiation or provide anonymity. Shopping can lead to regret or disappointment, but also to the fulfillment of desire. As sociologist Sharon Zukin has noted, quote, cultural theorists are only half right when they say that by choosing products, we choose our identity. Our identity is formed by the whole activity of shopping, an activity that we experience as both freedom and necessity. Markets are the original fulfillment networks, analog systems of procurement, processing, storage, and distribution, and increasingly relevant as architects work to understand how intertwined global and regional forces create spaces where architecture is not merely the result of specific conditions, but is an active agent in the network itself. These markets are field conditions, loose arrangements of stalls, stands, kiosk, or street vending elements. Their organization is primarily horizontal, their overall form is indifferent, but the local scale is highly organized. These spaces are useful to study as they physically represent individual spatial material acts and the collective social networks associated with their production. And this is a bazaar in Lviv, Ukraine. What anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss defined as bricolage, making do with institutional and cultural contexts, is a particularly useful term to consider in the Ukrainian context. Architects have explained this phenomenon similarly, as in Colin Rowe's use of the term collage, or Charles Jenks' ad hocism, or more recently, Keller Easterling's work on architectural entrepreneurialism. In addition, the anthropologist Anna Tsing uses the word friction to provide a more nuanced understanding of how, quote, regional to global networks of power, trade, and meaning are productive relationships and not one-sided exchanges. The difficulty of obtaining goods during the Soviet Union created a cultural network of alternative methods of procurement. The result was an informal economy of favors which were required to attain certain goods or services. This personal fulfillment system relied on relationships and loose social networks. According to some scholars, the Soviet Union, quote, forced all citizens to become micro-entrepreneurs, to enact entrepreneurship in the most mundane facets of everyday life. This microeconomic activity in many ways kept the economy from collapsing and provided a way for citizens to self-organize and procure the necessary goods to cope with food shortages and poor distribution networks. I believe that this culture of micro-entrepreneurship survives today in Ukraine in many aspects of daily life and is most clearly articulated in its markets and bazaars. Informal economic networks result in an architecture which gives form to economic systems, materializes loose social networks, and offers collective solutions to issues of scarcity. In a vacuum of planning, regulation, and enforcement, contemporary markets in Ukraine recall the vivid description of 17th century Rome found in Collage City, quote, that inextricable fusion of imposition and accommodation, that highly successful and resilient traffic jam of intentions, an anthology of closed compositions, and the ad hoc stuff in between, which is typically the best part. Ukraine has adopted some of the consumer and infrastructural norms of the West, namely the recent popularity of big box supermarkets. Supermarkets no doubt have certain advantages over bazaars or open air markets, including modern refrigeration, parking, climate-controlled interiors, and a one-stop shopping experience. However, as more big box stores open in Ukraine, open markets have not disappeared as they have in some other Eastern European countries. This seems to be because bazaars can serve different social functions and exhibit distinct material ethics, a term used by Rosalind Shea to describe a cultural attitude towards material use. For example, this circular market in Kyiv, housed in a Soviet modernist building, the circular building in the middle, is surrounded by open-air market and stalls. So customers can choose to shop at one or the other, but they often choose to shop at both and for different purposes. Though this type of architecture is often described as informal, I would argue that we need new terminology. Architects have overused the term informal to describe these spaces for two reasons. First, we've often conflated economic definitions of informality to definitions of architectural form. And second, architects have a tendency to focus on top-down forms of organization rather than bottom-up approaches. In fact, formality is a central concern to both the viewer and the curator in markets. They thrive on moments of localized formality within a sea of formal collage. Each modular unit is embedded with compositional logics, serialization, repetition, attention to scale, rhythm. Your eye bounces around the composition, finding new adjacencies, patterns, and color relationships. These spaces celebrate the serial logic of mechanical production to create an overwhelming aesthetic experience. Each stall is oriented to the central viewer, indifferent to the neighboring unit, a singular, immersive world standing alone. Objects are arranged meticulously daily. The stacking ability of objects of themselves is on display. In this example, nested pots form tall columns, or clusters of pots suggest new formal groupings. The seller's body often completes the arrangement, perched on a small stool or on a collection of wares. Here, everything is in its right place. I would argue that these designs are a new type of architectural regionalism. This region is not strictly geographical or intellectual, as Kenneth Frampton posited. This new form of regionalism is directly shaped by the interconnection between the desire of consumers and the availability of supply chain networks. In international relations, the concept of economic regionalism focuses on issues of globalization and the supply side of what it means to be fulfilled. But as a designer, I'm interested in defining a consumer regionalism, which is based on the production and assuagement of desire. Consumer regionalism is entrepreneurial. Its physical manifestation is a result of translated material assemblages, traditional spatial practices, and designed intentions. It is driven by type in all variations: formal types, aggregated shipping containers, modern Soviet halls, modular sidewalk kiosks, or legal types, legal and illegal markets, frowned upon commercial practices or black markets, or consumer types, markets for old people, markets for people who want produce from the villages, markets for people who want produce from imported EU countries. Market regionalism reveals the tension between the individual and the collective. It utilizes part-to-whole relationships in both formal and social constructions. One example, the 7th Kilometer Bazaar in Odessa here, offers an urbanism of systematic spatial adaptation. So born of a disruption in modern standardization, the market's main building material is discarded shipping containers. Since Soviet containers were not compatible with international standards, there was suddenly a surplus of slightly off shipping containers, which worked well for infrastructural needs like a market. The shipping containers can be opened and closed at the end of every day to lock the goods away. This market has grown to be one of the largest, so this is what it actually looks like, or what it looked like 2 days ago. This market has grown now to be one of the largest in Europe, and it exists within a kind of ambiguous regulation of tax exemptions and black market trading, but also offers a website where anyone can watch a live feed of the market activity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You too can watch it online. Market infrastructure, comprised of sheet metal, aluminum frames, crates, cardboard boxes, and wooden pallets, are used in their raw form as a neutral backdrop for to be embellished by the items for sale. Thus, the color and shape of each object becomes its most important material product. This is especially true where children's toys are concerned. For example, the number of items displayed at one time depends on how many color variations are available. Objects are their own advertisements, and color could symbolize the abundance of choices. Long aisles of shoe stalls are organized by type: men's shoes, running shoes, kids' shoes, black shoes, knockoff Nikes, shoes with 3 stripes, also known as knockoff Adidas, sandals, shoes with heels, slippers for guests, etc. Everything is within arm's reach or conspicuously just out of range. Of course, bazaars exist all over the world, not only in post-Soviet contexts, of course, but the specificity I'm describing comes from a combination of material objects and their unique cultural context. The designs of pots, the cuts of meats, the types of slippers, the availability of imported goods or unavailability are all highly determined by consumer regionalism and cultural specificity. For example, there's a colleague at the University of Indiana, currently writing the history of the plastic bag in Eastern Europe. If that sounds strange, it's because this single object, sold primarily today in Ukraine at bazaars, represents a complex interplay between cultural desire, global fulfillment networks, and regional history. It became popular as a symbol of Western as a symbol of Western products during a divided Germany, and remains today a cultural touchstone reused again and again. It is common to purchase one of these bags, usually with a knockoff logo of Hugo Boss or Hugo Boss, as in this image. Often BMW is another popular, a kind of knockoff BMW symbol in Ukraine is popular. And people will continue to use these bags for years and years, even rinsing them out, washing them, hanging them up to dry. So the story of objects does not begin and end with their production, but is designed through their use and reuse. So now for the last short portion of the presentation, I want to transition to one design project of Outpost Office, the firm that I direct with Eric Herman, of a project that we did in Ukraine last summer. So my research gave us a foundational understanding and methodologies for working in the Ukrainian context. But as designers, of course, we brought our own design intentions and contemporary interest to the project. So it's loosely based on the kind of research I've done, but is also its own kind of design project. So we were invited to work with the Kharkiv School of Architecture, Ukraine's first independent school of architecture, to design and curate an exhibition celebrating their first year of coursework. Open Work is an ongoing collaboration between Outpost Office and the Kharkiv School as they develop through the next years. The first part of the project was this exhibition, and the second part of the project will be a workshop that we're leading this coming summer, which is sponsored by the US State Department. The main question we wanted to ask with this design project was, what makes an architecture school? It's of course more than just the students' work, but it includes the material ephemera that surrounds the school, the space that it's in, the resources that it has available, and of course the scarcity which drives its innovation. So our first act as curators was to take stock of a year's worth of work at the school. We began by using bazaars both as a practical procurement method and a conceptual framework for design. We didn't try to replicate the aesthetics of the bazaars in the design, but we tapped into various forms of intelligence that are present, the grouping of objects, layers of visual information, and the uses of networks. We also used it literally as a procurement network, and so here we are buying the elements of the bazaar from a man who works at the bazaar, but who primarily sells to other bazaar vendors and not usually to the general public. So working with the students, we asked them to critically engage a typology, which they know very well. We were working with the Ukrainian students in this context, but to consider overlapping concerns of material economy, display, and storage. In doing so, they were able to tap into a network and use the system in new ways to create dynamic interactions which reflect the experience of the bazaar, not necessarily the form itself. The exhibition utilized these inexpensive materials, metal grating, glossy white tiles, and generic LED lights. The white metal grids became used as the exhibition's primary material, are typically used only by other bazaar vendors, but to densely display material goods. So we wanted to use them in a little bit different way. There were only a few parts: lights, plywood, metal, and the only connection were zip ties so that it could be disassembled and reassembled later as pinup boards or other pieces of furniture that they might need or infrastructure at the school. The details might appear complex, like overlapping pieces of metal, but they were quite simple and all completed on the school with the simple woodshop tools. In its final form, open work deployed organizational methods and detailing to create a system equally related to commercial acts of display and museum storage. We used the existing mezzanine level of the hall to construct a specific initial view of the work. The act of organizing and displaying objects gave the students the autonomy to speak through the medium of things, creating both individual and collective nonverbal narratives. The items on display included student models, as well as items borrowed from the school, lecture posters, books, pencils, pillows, hard hats, and woodworking tools. Students gave tours where they could each discuss individual items that influenced them throughout the year. And both the act of the curation and the act of viewing would require a more direct experience of the object itself, resulting in improvised interactions between participants and uncanny relationships. The exhibition is a floating archive that invites visitors to look at objects, touch them, and inspect them more closely. The design encourages visitors to behave as if they are at a bazaar where testing, touching, and tasting occur before purchasing. In an age of material excess, architecture is no longer tasked with the creation of totally new constructions. Increasingly, it is tasked with the recombination, reuse, and reorganization of the material abundance already existing in our built environment. This work shows how architecture can serve an infrastructural role for the informal, providing a framework for the organization of objects, an attitude towards the use of materials, and strategies for utilizing informal economic and social networks. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. What a rich set of design projects as we kind of get started.